Alright folks, I want to do something just a little bit different from what we normally do around here. This may or may not be satire. I want to talk about video games, and specifically I want to kind of throw out a very contrarian viewpoint that a lot of people may really disagree with and be upset with, but some people may actually agree with me. I've been waiting for someone to say it for a long time. This involves one of the most popular video game series of all time, if not the most beloved, and that's Nintendo's The Legend of Zelda. Now, The Legend of Zelda started in 1987 on the Famicom, got ported over to the NES in 1987? Was it 87 or 86? Well, it was one of those. And it was a huge hit. And, you know, I gotta say, just because I may be stating the game is overrated to a certain capacity does not mean that it is in any way, shape, or form a bad game, because I don't think the original The Legend of Zelda on the NES is a bad game at all. In fact, I think it's a really, really good game. If I made a list of the top 50 Nintendo Entertainment System games of all time, it would definitely be on the countdown. And, you know, it's very innovative. It's one of the first of its kind. It was clearly influential. And, you know, it's a good game all around. But as far as it being the absolute best game on the NES, or even the best game within its own genre, that I have to disagree with. And for the purpose of this video, we're going to kind of stick exclusively to the 2D games up until we get into the Game Boy Advance era. I'm doing that twofold because, number one, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the 3D Ocarina of Time Wind Waker games in a separate video later this summer. And also, you know, frankly, I really just don't have that much experience with the games that came out post-Wii and post-DS, so they could be good, they could be bad. Honestly, I just don't know, so I'm not going to bother commenting on them. So we're going to stick with everything from The Legend of Zelda on the NES all the way up until we get into, the Minish Cap. So we're covering the 2D traditional Zelda franchise mythos, this video in particular. Alright, so anyway, like I was saying, Legend of Zelda, very, very, very good game. But as far as being a comprehensively great game, well, you know, I gotta disagree with that, because I think it obviously feels dated. You go back and play the game now, the controls are a little stiff. The visuals certainly are not as good as some of the other contemporary games that came out there. Yeah, all you have to remember is, you know, look at The Legend of Zelda and realize that Mega Man 2 and DuckTales, these games look absolutely gorgeous that came out 2 years afterwards. And really, it's a no contest there in the visual department. And, you know, I think The Legend of Zelda, clearly, it's dated in many regards. You go in, the scrolling takes forever to load. You get little clouds minis pop up. Overall, the level layout, I mean, it's interesting. It's kind of a puzzle, and it's a maze, because it's one of the first games that most American gamers played that had that mechanic going on. So that I definitely understand, and I think that's cool. But at the same time, I mean, you know, look at the maps, they're really not that detailed. They're kind of minimalist. The dungeons really, especially when you look at later games in the series, really aren't that complicated. The boss fights are kind of boring. And I mean, ultimately, you really got to map everything down. You're just going to be lost the entire time. But I think overall, it's a good game. That said, within its own genre, the top-down action-adventure, light RPG video game format, I think there are two games in NES, right off the top of my head, that I think are much, much better versions of Zelda than Zelda. And the first game is Crystallis, which is by SNK, which I think is actually probably about as close as we're going to get to an 8-bit version of A Link to the Past. And I think in many ways, this game pretty much perfected the Zelda formula. It's like Zelda came along and it was a very good template for a game, but this game comes along and just completely kills it and makes it just completely awesome with better graphics, better weaponry, a better leveling up system, a more ingrained RPG mechanic to it. So I think obviously that game surpasses Zelda really at its own game. And the other game that I think definitely does not get anywhere near enough credit for what it is in terms of being an action-adventure game, and this is really surprising because it's also a game made by Nintendo, and that game is Star Tropics, which I think is probably one of, you know, the top 20 best games to ever come out on the NES. It's a terrific all-around game. And I think basically what it did was it took the Zelda template, refined it, came up with a more interesting RPG mechanic, had way more interesting dungeons, had more clever enemies, the bosses were cooler, the platforming was certainly much better than what you saw in Link, the second Zelda game, which I thought was just flat out a bad game. So yeah, Star Tropics Crystal Sing are both games that outdid Zelda at being Zelda. And kind of going back to that, the second Zelda game on NES, Link, very controversial. Some people like it, but I think really that's actually a pretty substandard game. In fact, I'm going to actually go to the next level and say it actually is a bad game. That, you know, if it wasn't called Zelda, if it were just some generic action RPG wannabe, we'd probably look at it as being very mediocre because it has a license it's celebrated. So, yeah, to recap on the NES, the first Zelda good, but there were games along the same genre template that I thought were better. And the second Zelda game in the NES just flat out sucked. Moving along to the SNES, there were really only one Zelda game that came out on Super Nintendo, obviously, Link to the Past. I think Link to the Past is definitely a great game. There are some people, I know the guy at Sid Lexia said it was the best video game ever made. Well, I'm going to disagree with that. I mean, I think it's a very good game, but it has its flaws. I think the time travel system, that mechanic is, you know, it's a little frustrating. There are certain things you have to do, like when you have to have a little magnifying glass and go into the animal world, where you have to look around and just turn it on at the exact right spot, at the exact right time to hope to find it, which I think is just kind of lazy. And the fact of the matter is, you know, that game is really more or less just a glorified fetch quest through and through. And, you know, it's a little bit too easy. I thought the fight with Ganon at the end was just a little bit too simplistic. I mean, the puzzles, admittedly, they were a little challenging, but, you know, towards the end, once you got the little water level, little factory thing, I thought that was a little bit too uninspired. But, I mean, it was good for what it was. I mean, the graphics were great, the music was great, really good ambiance. Basically, just a solid game overall in spite of every respect. But I think there were games within that genre on the Super Nintendo and also on the Genesis that I thought ultimately did a much better job of being what A Link to the Past tried to be. A couple of games in the SNES I want to bring out. The first one, obviously, probably the game you think of when you think of Zelda-inspired games, The Secret of Mana, which is, I think, an even better version of Link to the Past than A Link to the Past. And what makes this really sort of interesting is it actually has a multiplayer component. So it's multiplayer Zelda, and it's way better than the Four Swords Adventures that actually came on the Game Boy Advance years later. So I think Secret of Mana is definitely that same genre, but better. And definitely its sequel, which never came out in the US, I believe it was called Seiken Densetsu 2, or Seiken Densetsu 3 on the Super Famicom. Well, you know, I never played in the US because it never came out, but you can ROM it today, and it's absolutely outstanding. It's this huge, massive scale. Definitely one of the 10 best SNES games ever. Haven't tried that. Very much kind of in the same vein as Zelda, but I think, like I said, better. It does the mechanics better, greater scale, better visuals, better story, better atmosphere, just more satisfying overall. Another game kind of that similar vein is another game that never came out in the US called Terra Enigma, which is the third game in the series that started with Soul Blazer and Illusion of Gaia, which were in themselves really good Zelda-inspired games. But I think Terra Enigma really took it to the next level because it had this really great story, a lot of really cool RPG mechanics, and at the end of the day, I think it actually had not only a better time-hopping mechanic in place than A Link to the Past, I think its time-traveling mechanisms were actually better than what we saw in Chrono Trigger. And I love Chrono Trigger. Chrono Trigger is probably my favorite game on the SNES, but I think ultimately, in terms of that overall mechanic, there's probably no better game to implement on a 16-bit system than Terra Enigma. So there's, right off the top of my head, at least 3 games in the action-adventure light RPG category that I think are better than A Link to the Past Super Nintendo. But another one that no one ever talks about, which I think is actually even better than Link to the Past, is a Sega Genesis game called Crusader of Sinti, which is actually made by Atlas, the guys that made the Shin Megami Tensei games, and a couple others that are escaping me at the moment. But yeah, this was a game that admittedly was kind of a rip-off of A Link to the Past, but at the end of the day, I thought it actually kind of took a lot of the mechanics from that game and fine-tuned them and made them better. I mean, it was certainly way more challenging. It had more stuff going on. There was more interactivity. The controls were way more fluid. And it actually had probably the best gimmick that was never utilized for a Zelda game. In fact, you actually turned into a monster, and you could use that to go and fight enemies. That was just really awesome. That was a cool mechanic that it seems like it would be installed in a Zelda game, but it never actually came around. And I think this overall is just a much better game than Link to the Past. So, I mean, like I said, I'm not saying A Link to the Past is a bad game. I just think there are better games in its genre that pretty much do everything that game did, except better, with better visuals, better ambiance, better RPG implementation. Just my opinion, but, I'll put them side by side and I would agree by that, just showing them as a comparison. Okay, now, moving on to the Game Boy. I think probably my two favorite Zelda games ever, 2D, 3D, are The Legend of Zelda, Oracle of Ages, and Oracle of Seasons, which I'll lump in as, even though technically they're two different games, they're actually, I'm going to lump them in as an individual game. That's probably my all-time favorite. And my second favorite is actually the Minish Cap, which came out late in the Game Boy Advance cycle. And the interesting thing about these, not only are they 2D handheld games, I think they're the best games in the entire series, neither of these games are actually made by Nintendo. They're actually developed by Capcom, which some sort of strange, turn of events actually knew the system better. They would make a better Zelda game than Nintendo could. And, I think they're just outstanding games. Probably, I'll get to those in just a moment. First, we gotta talk about Link's Awakening. I love Link's Awakening. It's probably one of my top 10 favorite Game Boy games ever. It really is impressive, for what it set out to do. It's really impressive. It accomplished a whole lot. It was a very great shrunken down version of Zelda. In fact, I actually like it better than A Link to the Past or in the NES Zelda games. I think it's a better overall Zelda experience compared to those. And obviously it's ported to the Game Boy Color with the Director's Cut, which is definitely the Criterion Collection version of that game. And as before, that's one of the best games of its time on that handheld system in the 90s. But that said, I'm going to throw something out here that's going to sound a little crazy, but I actually think there was a game that came out on the Sega Game Gear. It didn't make it in the US, but it was released in Japan, which I think is actually even better than Link's Awakening. It's a game called Sylvan Tale. And basically Sylvan Tale, what it was obviously it was inspired by Zelda. It was Sega's attempt to imitate the Zelda mechanics. And once again, I think they just did an outstanding job with it. The controls I thought were more fluid. It had a more adult kind of story. I mean, not really adult, but it was a little bit less cartoony. It had more twists and turns. It was more of a traditional JRPG, narratively wise, compared to Link's Awakening. And I just thought it was a great game. It had some really cool platforming elements. The combat was excellent. Outstanding exploration. The level design was top notch. The dungeons were just very well done. And ultimately I thought it was just a really, really great Zelda game that didn't have the Zelda license. So I thought it was actually better than what Nintendo was doing at the same time frame. And like I said, I mean, you can put these games side by side and play them objectively. I think, it's pretty clear which one is the better in terms of ambiance, better in terms of presentation, and definitely more innovative in terms of controls and other gameplay mechanics. But like I said, all that, not to say that, any of these games are bad by any stretch, but I think they're all fantastic. I just think there are better games out there within that respective genre. And, going on, like I said, I really can't say much about the Game Boy Color games because at that point you really didn't have much competition on the Game Gear anymore. The only real competition you have were the 3D Zelda games. Like I said, I'll cover that later on throughout the summer. I don't know when, but I'll make that video eventually. But really can't complain. I think, like I said earlier, Oracle of Ages, Oracle of Seasons, great games. The Minish Cap, really, really great games. And, I don't know, I think ultimately they're my two favorite Zelda games, three favorite Zelda games, if you want to be technical about it. And I think they're actually kind of influenced a little bit more by some of the Zelda-inspired games. I think you look at those games that kind of went out there, they kind of copied even some of the non-genre competition, like Chrono Trigger. There's some elements of Final Fantasy in there. And I think it just made for a really fine-tuned game. The Zelda template is great, but I think Capcom really capitalized on it and made it something truly, truly outstanding. So that's just my general thoughts. If you haven't played games like Sylvan Tale, or if you haven't went out and played the Secret of Mana games or Star Tropics, I really want you to kind of go up there and just play them side by side and kind of look at them and the games you've been playing and just kind of, look at it from a different perspective. Try to go into it with a different mindset. And I think you'll see that while the Zelda games are indeed very good, if not bordering on great, they're still not the absolute best their genre has to offer. But I'd love to hear your opinion. Am I wrong? Is there something you can say to convince me otherwise? Have I not played the games enough? What is it that I'm missing in these respective Zelda games that make them better than the games I mentioned earlier? And of course, I want you to play them first, because I want you to come out and say, hey, here's a game you never played before. I think it's better because I'm biased that way. So anyway, my thoughts, I'd love to hear yours. Let's bring them on.